opens diagonals for queen and bishop, immediately challenging the center and controlling key squares for swift development. Embracing a solid, positional structure, black prepares to contest the center and develop pieces harmoniously, hinting at a flexible French defense approach. Asserting central dominion, white immediately challenges black's pawn, shaping the game's pawn structure and fighting for space. Challenging the center directly, black initiates a battle for central influence and opens up the queen side. Developing the knight to c3 fortifies the pawn center and prepares for further kingside expansion, a cornerstone of the queen's gambit setup. Developing the knight to a central square immediately challenges white's pawn structure and prepares for further piece activity. Pushes the knight back, gaining space and opening a diagonal for the bishop. Safeguarding the knight while preparing a kingside pawn advance, this maneuver subtly reinforces black's central presence and opens avenues for piece development. A bold gambit to seize central space, though it weakens the kingside diagonal. Challenging white's central space head-on, black injects immediate tension and seeks piece activity. Bolstering the central advance, this knight repositions to a vital outpost, reinforcing the e5 pawn while preparing to contest control of the d4 square and potentially participate in a queenside expansion. Asserting central presence, the knight now actively contests d4 and f5 squares, a crucial step in reinforcing black's pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breaks like c5, c4, or f7, f6. Prioritizing development and establishing a solid pawn structure, white bolsters the kingside presence and prepares to launch an attack while simultaneously defending the e5 pawn. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies black's kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, creating a more robust defense against white's central space advantage. Positioning the queen on d2 secures the e4 pawn from immediate knight capture and prepares for a potential kingside attack by linking with the f-pawn advance, while also offering a safe retreat should black's central pressure become too intense. Safeguarding the monarch is a sensible priority, as the central tension initiated by white's pawn advance on e5 necessitates royal security, allowing the pieces to better participate in the unfolding strategic battle without the immediate threat of exposure. Clearing the center pawn structure opens a diagonal for white's queen, potentially targeting weaknesses on the kingside while immediately challenging black's central presence. Reclaiming the central pawn opens up lines of attack and frees the knight for active engagement. Embracing the opposite side castling scenario transforms this opening into a dynamic race for initiative, where both monarchs become potential targets for pawn storms and tactical incursions. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside with this advance, black aims to disrupt white's castled king and potentially create counterplay on the exposed queenside, while simultaneously preparing to contest the open c-file. Shifting the queen from the d-file, where it was potentially vulnerable to discovered attacks along the c-file and faced obstruction from white's own pawns, now prepares for potential kingside activity and shores up the e5 pawn. Initiating a long-term pawn lever on the queenside, this move aims to liberate black's queen-bishop and establish a more active presence on that flank, subtly contesting white's spatial advantage without immediately committing to aggressive pawn pushes. Securing the monarch from potential knight incursions on c3 or b4, and clearing the path for potential pawn pushes like c4 is the immediate strategic goal behind this king maneuver, creating a subtle but important defensive posture against black's developing pieces and the open d-file. The queen tucks back, reinforcing d7's knight while preparing to contest the c-file, a wise repositioning after white's castling queenside signals aggressive intentions. The bishop's relocation to d3 initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to exert pressure along the diagonal and potentially reinforce the kingside defenses. This maneuver prepares for a future advance or piece consolidation, subtly dictating the board's spatial dynamics and hinting at a desire to control key squares. Boldly challenging white's central control, this knight repositioning on b4 aims to exploit the open diagonal for the bishop on d3, and potentially disrupt white's castled king's safety. Shifting the queen to g3 aims to re-establish pressure along the g-file, potentially targeting the f6 knight and the kingside structure that black has been carefully building. It's a proactive step to disrupt black's nascent counterplay developing on the queenside and to regain some initiative after the somewhat passive placement of the bishop on d3. Black bravely challenges white's space advantage by initiating pawn liberation, aiming to unblock the knight and potentially activate the f-file, though this could create weaknesses around the king. Unleashing the queen from its protective shell, the monarch now ventures towards the queenside flank, aiming to pressure black's developing pieces and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. This ambitious repositioning signals a desire to activate white's queen in the complex arising from black's pawn push and knight maneuver, seeking dynamic counterplay rather than passive defense. Challenging the advanced pawn and aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure with this knight exchange, black seeks to create counterplay. The knight hops into a position where it forces white to address its presence, potentially sacrificing material or compromising pawn structure in return. Consider the long-term implications for control of the c-file and the potential for increased activity from black's remaining pieces if white mismanages the exchange. Opening a diagonal for the queen and potentially the light-squared bishop, this capture fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a potential long-term weakness on d3 while simultaneously granting white increased central influence and a clearer path for attacking down the c-file. A probing pawn thrust, 16. a5 seeks to gain space on the queenside and potentially open lines for black's pieces, though it also creates a target on the queenside that white might exploit later. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, white seeks to exploit the closed nature of the center and the slight overextension of black's queenside play, aiming to create attacking chances directly at the black king. Black sidesteps the immediate king's flank storm, prioritizing the safety of the queen and preparing to connect the rooks, while subtly acknowledging the central space advantage white has gained. A bold pawn thrust, sacrificing material for initiative and aiming to pry open the kingside. A bold gambit on the kingside has opened avenues for both sides, and now black confronts the pawn storm by reclaiming central influence. This recapture on f5 isn't merely about regaining material. It's a decisive reassertion of control over the d5 square, aiming to undermine white's advanced pawn chain and potentially neutralize the initiative born from that aggressive kingside expansion. Observe how the doubled f-pawns, though a structural weakness, now provide a defensive shield for the king, while the knight on d7, freed from its defensive post, can now contemplate repositioning to a more active square, perhaps to c6 or even b4. The battle for the center is far from over, and this move signals black's intent to fight for it aggressively. Unlocking the g-file for an aggressive pursuit, rhg1 signifies a pivotal moment where white transitions from tentative maneuvering to a direct assault, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and the open file for his rook. Opening a critical diagonal for the bishop offers a potent counterthrust, directly challenging the king's protective screen and forcing white to reckon with immediate threats on the queenside. Unleashing a bold queen sacrifice threat, white creates immediate and disorienting pressure on black's kingside, forcing a rapid and potentially difficult decision that could unravel black's careful defensive setup. The dark-squared bishop's retreat to d8, a seemingly passive maneuver, masterfully creates a vital diagonal path for its counterpart on a6, simultaneously bolstering the king's defenses and subtly preparing for potential central breaks. Unleashing the pawn chain's pressure, this advance carves open lines towards the black king and demands immediate attention, creating a dynamic imbalance. A bold gambit to disrupt white's initiative, offering a pawn to unlock diagonals and create counterplay. The knight's centralizing maneuver, steering towards a potential outpost on d7 or f7, dramatically escalates the positional pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled monarch. The king's safety is suddenly paramount. Black's intention with this queen repositioning is to create a defensive shield, perhaps preparing to bring more pieces into the fray to bolster the beleaguered monarch. A bold foray into the heart of black's position, This move seizes the central pawn and creates immediate tactical fireworks, forcing black to confront a sharp dilemma with the exposed king. Sensing a reprieve, black redirects the rook to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge the imposing white queen and potentially secure open lines for counterplay. Reclaiming the initiative on the c-file, white prepares to challenge black's precarious bishop placement, aiming to dismantle the queenside pawn structure and exploit the open lines that are beginning to emerge. A bold sacrifice, aiming to disrupt the vital diagonal and open lines for counterplay, though it does leave the king exposed momentarily. Preserving the king's sanctuary amidst this tactical storm, the castled king seeks refuge on a more secure square, a prudent decision prioritizing defensive solidity over immediate pawn advances that might otherwise expose its flank. Finally, black brings the bishop back into play, aiming to shore up the kingside and prepare for a more active defense, perhaps eyeing the weakened white king that has been somewhat exposed by the early castling queenside. Seizing control of that crucial open file with the knight offers a dynamic positional advantage, threatening to unravel black's defensive structure. An audacious gambit emerges from the defense, sacrificing material for potentially decisive attacking lines against white's compromised monarch. Unleashing a daring queen sortie, white gambits piece material in hopes of shattering black's solid defenses and exposing their monarch. Boldly seeking counterplay, black intercepts the queen's path and aims to disrupt white's centralized piece activity, hoping to activate the bishop on a6 and create tactical opportunities against the exposed white king. Unlocking the bishop's long-range potential, this recapture immediately targets the exposed enemy king by opening a diagonal. The rook's re-entry into the fight via the b-file re-establishes a crucial defensive structure, aiming to disrupt white's aggressive pawn storm and create counterplay against the exposed king. The kingside pawn storm has finally broken open, but the king is now exposed to a barrage of checks along the open 8th rank. The rook's daring journey to the 8th rank, though it might seem like a bold gambit for counterplay, surrenders valuable central control and potentially isolates itself. Recapturing the rook with the queen now opens up a dynamic battle where the queen must be vigilant against the opposing knight's threats. Unlocking the kingside potential, this move aims to create a central pawn presence and potentially open lines for future counterplay, a clever attempt to disrupt white's dominant rook on the c-file and establish a more balanced pawn structure. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately applies immense pressure, threatening to split black's queenside defenses and exploit the exposed king. Black finally retrieves a piece, but the immediate consequence of this recapture is a severe disruption of white's queen and rook coordination, potentially creating opportunities for counterplay along the newly opened diagonals. Unleashing a pawn assault to pry open black's king, white aims to exploit the open files and the exposed monarch by creating advanced passed pawns. Opening up the kingside with g4 and then leaving it exposed, white now faces a desperate defense as black mobilizes their bishops, and this timely repositioning of the bishop to d5 aims to solidify the central control and prepare for a potential queenside advance, possibly targeting the now undefended white queen. Reasserting central influence, the queen repositions to prepare for a more dynamic engagement across the board, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's structure. Targeting the weak queenside pawn with the queen now aims to exploit the open files and the awkward placement of white's pieces, potentially creating tactical opportunities or forcing concessions. This capture drastically simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where white's material advantage, a rook for a knight and pawn, should be decisive, but black's passed pawn on the queenside and exposed white king on a1 demand careful, precise play to prevent counterplay and ensure the win. The queen's exchange liberates the rook on the file and sets the stage for a potential breakthrough with the remaining rook on the b-file, though black needs to be wary of white's king's now less exposed position. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, white aims to exploit the open lines and create immediate threats against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Harnessing the newly opened diagonal for the bishop offers black a pathway to activate its dormant potential, eyeing the weakened pawn structure around white's king and potentially creating threats down the c-file. Reclaiming the open central file with the rook aims to neutralize black's queenside initiative and re-establish a more balanced pawn structure. Opening up the king's pawn chain often signals a willingness to engage in a risky dance, and this capture squarely embraces that notion. By taking the pawn on h5, black is essentially saying, I'm willing to sacrifice some structural integrity for the chance to create counterplay down the newly opened g-file. However, this also exposes the f5 pawn and, more importantly, removes a crucial defender from the path of white's rook. The immediate consequence is a gain of a pawn, but the long-term implications could involve a weakened kingside pawn structure if white can effectively exploit the open g-file and the vulnerable f5 pawn. It's a bold gambit that demands careful follow-up to justify the positional concessions. Unleashing the knight's full potential, the white steed charges towards the center, seeking to disrupt the enemy pawn structure and pry open critical diagonals. The bishop's repositioning onto f3 aims to disrupt white's already compromised pawn structure and threaten the knight on d7, while simultaneously opening lines for potential counterplay. The king's exposed position after the pawn storm now becomes a glaring weakness. Preparing a swift invasion through the now open files is paramount for forcing concessions. Reactivating the bishop to this central square offers dynamic counterplay, aiming to dislodge white's formidable rook and create infiltration possibilities on the c-file. Reclaiming central space and preparing to contest the now open rook file demands this repositioning of the rooks. A desperate attempt to untangle the bishop from its passive pinning and seek refuge on a more active square, though its return to the a8h1 diagonal seems unlikely to alter the grim positional reality. A decisive royal escort begins with this forcing check, aiming to dismantle black's defensive pawn wall and expose the king. A desperate attempt to activate the weakened monarch after a series of positional concessions. Exploiting the exposed royal family, white forces a decisive exchange that rips open the path to the king. Abandoning the king opens the door for a decisive white attack on the weakened queenside pawn structure. Seizing the opportunity presented by the pinned bishop, the knight is removed, simplifying the position and creating an immediately winning material advantage for white. The immediate focus shifts to securing the relocated monarch from the menacing rook on the 7th rank. Consolidating material advantage and preparing a determined march for the remaining pawns, this placement asserts control over the queenside and aims to restrict black's rook activity. That pawn's aggressive advance aims to unleash the bishop from its cornered position, though it risks creating weaknesses that the opponent might exploit later on. This check forces the black king onto a less secure square, a calculated risk to exploit the exposed royal. Finding refuge and regrouping, the black king seeks sanctuary on the kingside after the relentless pressure from the white rook. The rook repositions, seeking an open line and preparing to press its advantage in this increasingly open endgame scenario, potentially eyeing the weak pawns on the kingside or supporting a further advance. The pawn's advance creates a crucial defensive barrier, anchoring the king and preventing immediate pawn breaks on the kingside. Bringing the rook back to the d2 square secures the a7 pawn from any immediate threats and prepares to challenge the h4 pawn, which is currently black's only active pawn on the kingside. This maneuver also potentially opens up lines for the rook to support a potential queenside pawn push later on, although the current position is heavily simplified and the primary goal is to consolidate the advantage. The bishop repositions itself for a potential sortie to the queen's side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create passed pawn threats, while simultaneously offering support to the isolated king. A strategic repositioning to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential pawn advances. A desperate gambit to create counterplay, hoping to tangle the enemy monarch in its own exposed position. Pushing the pawn here aims to gain breathing room for the king and potentially prepare a pawn breakthrough later, but it also weakens the light squares around white's monarch and invites black's bishop to advance further into white's territory. Stabilizing the rook on the 5th rank after that aggressive pawn push offers a chance to regroup and prepare for the inevitable fight for open files. Activating the bishop to its rightful diagonal, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially create a discovered attack down the file. The black king, having marched forward, now seeks to support the advanced pawns and participate in the potential pawn race, aiming to create a connected passed pawn on the queen side. Seizing the open file offers a vital path to pressure black's pinned bishop and potentially expose the king. Capturing the pawn, black aims to simplify the board and create a passed pawn, but this allows white's remaining pieces to gain greater mobility and potentially swarm the black king. The king shuffles into a slightly safer square, an attempt to sidestep the looming threat of the knight on A. Embracing the open file is a bold endeavor, as the rook now stands poised to exert pressure down the d-file, aiming to dislodge white's last bastion of defense in the center and potentially disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure on the king side. Refocusing the rook to the center is a subtle attempt to reignite activity, seeking a more advantageous square than the wing where it was relegated, and preparing to exploit the currently exposed black king and the potential for breakthroughs in the pawn structure if the opponent misplaces their pieces. Seizing the open file here redirects the rook's pressure to the queen side, aiming to support the advancing pawns and potentially create a passed threat. The pawn push aims to break the blockade and unlock the rook on the queen side, seeking an active role in the endgame. The bishop's diagonal thrust finally clears a path, forcing the white king into an even tighter corner, a desperate attempt to escape the encroaching pawns and the looming threat of zugzwang. Seizing the open file becomes paramount as the king is forced into a cramped position. By advancing, white aims to restrict black's counterplay and create opportunities on the queen side. The king's desperate scramble for safety is interrupted by a check, forcing a fundamental reassessment of the immediate defensive setup. The king's wanderings now become the focal point as white maneuvers to regain the initiative. This audacious repositioning of the bishop to the queenside flank opens up fascinating possibilities for black, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. Shifting the rook to the c-file immediately targets the pawn chain's vulnerability and prepares a forceful advance towards the opponent's weakened king position, while also creating potential mating threats down the diagonal. Unleashing the rook to eye the open file, this aims to exploit the white king's awkward placement and pressure a potential pawn weakness on the queen side. Pushing the rook to the 7th rank immediately forces the black bishop to defend the crucial squares, creating a dynamic tension where material exchange seems inevitable and will lead to a dramatically simplified yet still complex situation for both monarchs. Repositioning the bishop to a waiting stance on f1 suggests a plan to support the upcoming pawn advance with the h-pawn, aiming to create a passed threat on the king side. The rook anchors itself, securing a dominant perch on the 6th rank to clamp down on black's advancing pawns and restrict the enemy bishop's activity along the diagonal. The rook now retreats, seeking a more active outpost on the 2nd rank, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially tie down the king in the subsequent endgame phase. A desperate push to unblock the passed pawn, hoping for a tactical miracle given the otherwise hopeless position. The knight's repositioning aims to bolster the kingside defenses, creating a more robust pawn structure by preparing to support the advanced pawns and potentially launch a counterattack on the queenside if an opportunity arises. Unleashing a final, crushing check, white forces the black king into an inescapable mating net where its remaining defenders are hopelessly outmaneuvered. The king's desperate flight continues, seeking refuge on the dark squares, but this relocation only seems to tighten the net. It must become a more active participant, not just a fleeing entity, to offer any hope of defense. Shifting the rook to the 6th rank creates a powerful central anchor, aiming to restrict black's passed pawn and coordinate with the bishop to potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. The defender reestablishes its bishop's protection and prepares to support the pawn's advance, aiming to create a passed pawn. The bishop now shores up the pawn structure from behind, a subtle but vital defensive task as the rook lurks menacingly. Black's king finally finds a temporary sanctuary on g4, a crucial repositioning that aims to shield it from the relentless white rook's pressure and eye any potential breakthroughs on the king side. Clearing the path for the rook to invade and disrupt Black's pawn structure is the aim here, exploiting the weakness on the 7th rank. Black finally pushes that pawn forward, an aggressive assertion hoping to disrupt White's coordinated pieces and perhaps create a passed threat. This capture finally clears the way for White's queen to become more actively involved, but it comes at the cost of allowing Black's pawn to advance further and potentially become a dangerous passed pawn in the endgame. The rook's descent from the 6th rank, snatching the pawn, heralds a decisive shift. The king is now exposed on the h-file, a target for the remaining queen and bishop. The infiltration of the 7th rank is now complete, establishing a formidable outpost for the white rook, poised to disrupt any remaining Black defenses and march towards a swift conclusion. Sacrificing the bishop to activate the rook along the open file signals a desperate attempt to find counterplay and disrupt White's menacing passed pawn, though the king's exposure remains a significant concern. The king bravely ventures out, seeking safety on the wing where fewer threats lurk, and eyeing a potential escape route that could lead to a more active role in the endgame. Chasing the enemy king to the rim often leaves it vulnerable, but now, with your king exposed on the queen side, it's your turn to worry about its safety as the rook's eye open lines.